Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending our first ever live stream. My name is Anthony Baker, and I'm a field education and outreach representative with the Fire and Police Pension Association. I may have met many of you at a department visit or maybe one of our other seminars in the past. Now, in light of current events, we're finding new ways to continue supporting our members and are excited to have the opportunity to use technology to continue our outreach to employers, members, and retirees. We've created this live stream today because we understand that everyone is being affected differently by this pandemic. In particular, those of you on the front lines have had to sacrifice a lot to keep our communities safe. And of course, that can lead to increased stress and anxiety. So we're doing what we can to support you. We've recently opened a new page on our website containing some helpful resources for mental health. On that page, there are several documents graciously provided by our speaker today. The link to that page is in the video description section on the YouTube stream. And for those of you attending by Zoom, you can use the short link of fppa.co/COVID-health. Now, I'll repeat that address at the end of the presentation. That being said, let's move on to introductions. As I said, my name is Anthony, and I'm a field education and outreach rep with FPPA. We also have my teammate, Phil Borgman here. He's going to moderate our question and answer portion of this presentation. Phil, you can say hi.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your service, and thanks for joining this afternoon.
We also have Ryan Woodhouse here. He's our digital content specialist, and he's working hard to make sure that this stream continues to run smoothly. You can say hi, Ryan.
Hey everyone, thanks for being here, and I'll do my best.
Thank you, Ryan. And lastly, we have our star participant, Dr. John Nicoletti. For those of you not already familiar, Dr. Nicoletti of Nicoletti Flater Associates is a board certified psychologist specializing in police and public safety. During his career, he has established himself as a national expert in police psychology, violence risk assessment, workplace and school violence prevention, as well as crisis intervention and trauma recovery. He has worked with over 250 national corporations, government agencies, schools, and religious institutions, and has co-authored several books. It is my pleasure to pass the video over to Dr. John Nicoletti. Dr. Nicoletti, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. Good afternoon to everybody. What I'm going to try and do in the time I have is kind of focus on a few different areas, looking at what it causes us and then what can we do to mitigate. First area I want to focus on is the pandemic itself. What does the COVID-19 do to us, to our families? Then I want to move into quarantine, shelter in place, safer at home. What does that do? And then the third area, hopefully you haven't had to deal with this, is the loss of a family member or loved one to COVID. And the fourth area, which we're slowly getting into, is what we call recovery, recoil, and resiliency. So starting with the pandemic, pretty much there's no blueprint for this. The last one we had to deal with was 1917 or 18 with the Spanish flu. Therefore, it's an invisible enemy. Especially for those of you in law enforcement and firefighting, you're used to being in control, taking charge of things. So what happens with this is you can't be proactive. Best you can be is reactive. One of the things we're seeing that seems to be increasing is what we call circuit overload in terms of the psyche, the brain, and the stress level. What do I mean by that? You turn on the TV, you get on the internet, you start reading. And every day, every evening, here's the order of stuff you'll get. The first thing you'll hear is how many new cases of COVID have just occurred. Second thing you'll hear is how many people have been hospitalized. Third thing you'll hear is how many people have been put on ventilators. And usually you'll hear that 80 to 90% of the people on ventilators never get out alive. And then the next thing you'll hear is how many people have died. So that's pretty much the news flow. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That takes its toll on us. It's what we call too much, too long, too ugly. And if that's all you're getting, you may not recognize it at first, but when it becomes cumulative, just starts increasing. Then what happens if you don't control your anxiety or stress at that point in time, what we're finding is you'll start getting into fatalistic thinking. Well, sooner or later, I'm going to get it, or some of my family members start getting it. And then it even gets worse because you start hearing, well, in order to get through this virus is you have to have what we call herd immunity. With herd immunity, that means you got to get it and recover from it. So then people start thinking, well, it's better to get it now rather than waiting. So it's like you're just waiting for the other shoe to drop. And that begins to interfere with kind of the rest of your lifestyle. I'm going to kind of interject this with quarantine now. You all are first responders. So while most of the world is having to shelter in place, quarantine, stay at home, whatever terminology y'all want to use, you're out there in the trenches. So you're having to deal with two unique stressors. The first one is what we call self-contamination. You're out there, you're responding to people, and you're wondering, okay, which person that I deal with today will contaminate me? So you're looking at, okay, is my PPE working? Is it going to keep working? Then the other thing we're seeing, this tends to be increasing. The longer this goes on, the more family pressure we're starting to see. What we're seeing there is, if your family members, like your kids, school's out, so they're learning at home, remote learning, and if your significant other is also sheltering in place because their job has furloughed them, they'll start to worry about you bringing the COVID-19 home with you. So that's creating kind of a pressure. They're worried about you bringing it home. You're worried about getting it, but you're also needing to kind of do your job out in the field. The other thing we're seeing in terms of dealing with this, and it ties into the quarantine, is kids, unless you've started out homeschooling your children, reality is kids aren't used to homeschooling. Kids aren't used to remote learning. The other thing, you know, we work with school districts, is teachers aren't used to doing remote learning either. So it's a new experience on both ends, and it's stressful for both of them. So keep in mind when you're starting to feel stressed out, your little ones are probably doing that too. Now, what are some of the symptoms we're seeing as a result of the pandemic and as a result of the quarantine? Obviously, increase in stress, physiological symptoms, and you've probably read this, and there's a lot of research showing that, is dreams are starting to get real weird because you're dealing with an invisible enemy and you don't know how to control it. The other thing that couples are realizing is in a relationship, you and your partner have what are called minimum and maximum contact time. In other words, every relationship in order to survive has to have a minimum amount of time that you two are together. If you start dropping below that, it creates problems. So generally, especially in your job, you've probably realized that already. What couples haven't realized is there's a maximum amount of time you can tolerate your partner. And then you reach what we call tilt. And what happens when you get on tilt is your psyche flips. It goes from what we call focusing on macro stimuli to focusing on micro stimuli. And that tells you you're going down the rabbit hole. Macro stimuli, like with me being talking right now. Micro stimuli would be the background noises you're hearing as you're listening to this video. So if you're on tilt, your body's going to be hypersensitive to micro stimuli related to your family. For example, you all are having breakfast, you're eating cornflakes. If you're on tilt, you'll start hearing your partner or your kids crunch the cornflakes and gulp the milk. And that's going to be like fingernails on a chalkboard. And you're going to start finding that all these little things get to you. The person you sleep with, when they exhale, their nose whistles. That's all you can hear. Here's where the problem develops. All issues start out as what we call in our world of psychology, situational adjustments. Situational adjustments to trauma or whatever. And that's the level we want you to handle that. If you don't handle it at the situational adjustment level, then we add another word. We add the word disorder. And once the word disorder gets put in there, then that means the problem's a little more in depth. PTS, post-traumatic stress. That's the level, we want it at. We want to be able to process it. You don't deal with it, we add another word, post-traumatic stress disorder. That means it's becoming more difficult. Panic attacks. You have a panic attack, it's just that, it's a panic attack. If you don't deal with it, then we add another word, panic disorder. So as soon as we start adding the word disorder, then you let the problem become a little more complex. And what happens is we create our own brand of misery. I don't know if any of you got to the point where you're focused on microstimuli. Kids are getting on your nerve, your spouse is getting on your nerve. All of a sudden you lose it and you snap at it. If any of you have ever done that, you're probably afterwards feeling an interesting feeling called guilt. Guilt is a gift that keeps on giving. And then if you start feeling guilty, then you get into catastrophic thinking. Oh my God, I've just ruined my children because I snapped at them. And then one problem builds on another. So the key is identifying. During this phase, you really got to start paying attention to yourself and do what we call self-monitoring and self-care. One of the other things we're seeing is, especially for folks who are sheltering in place or quarantine, is they start giving up all their coping skills. Coping skills may be exercising, doing different things, and a lot of it is a reality because the gyms are closed, the movie theaters are closed, all the things we're used to doing are closed. So what we're finding are people get caught in ruts, and some of the ruts actually involve you get up in the morning and you wear the same outfit. If you don't have to go to work, you get up and put your sweats on and your hoodie, and that's your usual outfit that you continue. So you get caught in the routine. Another good way to look at pandemic and quarantine, and we always tell individuals to watch this video called Groundhog Day. It was a video with Bill Murray, but it's very similar to life. Same day, every day, in and out. So it's a good idea to watch that movie and see kind of what happens when he starts fighting and what happens when he finally adapts to it from that standpoint. So the key thing is, how do you adapt to Groundhog Day? What are some things you need to consider? First thing you need to consider is routines. The body needs goals. The psyche needs things to look forward to. If you're losing sight of that, then that's putting you down a rabbit hole. The other thing that's going to happen is you may lose your motivation. You may be saying, as soon as I feel better, I'm going to get up and start working out. As soon as I feel better, I'm going to start doing such and such. Ain't going to happen. You wait till you feel better to do things that won't happen. The way the body works is what I call fake it till you make it. In other words, you got to force yourself to go through these things. Force yourself to work out. Force yourself to change your clothes. Force yourself to get out and do something. The other thing that's important is what we call rules of engagement. Sit down and talk about things. It's okay to say to your partner or your kids or vice versa that, hey, we can only tolerate each other for so long. What are some ways we can do to decompress and get away from each other? You don't have to take that as gee, I'm being rejected. There's something the matter with our relationship. We'll have people come in for counseling saying, okay, we're having problems in our relationship. We're drifting apart. The other person seems cold. And it's not a problem with the relationship. It's just your perception. At times like this, you're not going to have what we call growth. We look at relationships in 4 areas: damage control, problem solving, maintenance, and growth. Problem solving, obviously, that's where we're worried about domestic violence, abuse, those type of things, child abuse. Problem solving is trying to get through this, trying to live with the virus, trying to stay protected. Maintenance is doing the day-to-day life. So at best right now is you're going to be between problem solving and maintenance. There's no way you're going to feel self-actualized. There's no way you're going to feel in the growth phase. I mean, if you do, that's great. So you need to change your expectations about what life's going to be like right now. The other thing, realize that this is stressful on your kids, so they may start acting out. You may start seeing more problems with them. Again, look at it as a situation and bring them into the fold in terms of, okay, what can we do to help you deal with this type of stuff? How are we going to get through this as a family? It's okay to schedule time to have fun. It's okay to schedule time to laugh and enjoy yourself. So look at how do we do that? And also, it's very important. You need to limit the amount of time you listen to the media and you listen to the news. Because like I said, it's too much, too long, too ugly. It takes you down the rabbit hole. So look at how you're going to handle this thing. Now, this is a tough one. Hopefully you haven't had to deal with it. And that's loss of a loved one to COVID-19. It's a different type of loss. It's a different type of death. One of the things we see in families who've lost somebody to COVID-19, which is unique to this type of pandemic, is that person, chances are, will die alone. You know, you take them to the hospital, they're not going to let you go in the room. Best you can do is make sure they have an iPad and you have an iPad and you can talk to them. But the reality is they're going to die alone. And then you're going to feel on the outside and you're going to feel helpless. And you're going to feel guilty. And you're going to feel like, I never got closure from this person. Those are tough things to kind of resolve, to go through the grief phase. In order to start going through grief phase, you have to really kind of resolve the fact that you couldn't say goodbye to them. How do you handle that? Look at symbolically. How can you say goodbye to somebody that you didn't get a chance to say goodbye to? It sounds really bizarre, but it actually works. Is write them a letter or have the children write a letter to you. Even though the person's gone, it does help the psychic deal. Now, and I know I'm going through this kind of fast. I don't have a lot of time. We're getting close to what we call the recovery phase. Recovery, before that is a word called recoil. And then after recovery is resiliency. What's happening as people start to get to that? You're going to have what's called anticipatory anxiety. You're wanting to get back out there, but there's another thing that's going to start eating at people. And depending on how resilient you are, will help you deal with this. Resilience is a continuum. On the low end of the continuum is what's called rigidity, a rigid person. On the high end is resiliency. Darwin talked about survival of the fittest, and that really applies here. It doesn't go to the individual that's the smartest and the strongest and fastest. It'll go to the person who adapts the quickest. So part of dealing with the new normal is being able to adapt. How do we do that? How do you adapt to the new normal? In order to adapt to the new normal, you've got to figure out what is the new normal. And you also have to decide what was the old normal. And you got to decide what's changed. So one of the things that's helpful is make a list of things in your life you used to do. Then look at, okay, can we still do it? That means the old normal is the new normal, so there's no change. And there'll be things like that. Then the next level you look at is old normal to new normal. In other words, okay, how do we adapt to this? And that's where you're looking at things like social distancing and wearing face masks and stuff like that. How are you going to adapt to that? Then the third category, which is the hardest, is what we call old normal to never more. Meaning, no, that's going to be gone forever. So once you get that category, hopefully you don't have too many in there, but you got to look at how do I adapt with never more? first stage in adapting, or first step in adapting to nevermore, is looking at what needs did I used to get met by that activity. We do things because we have needs that get met by it. But what you do with the nevermore and also the new normal, you look at, okay, what needs did I meet by being able to do this? Then you got to look at, okay, in what way can I meet the needs? What's some new ways I can meet the needs? Because even though the activity's gone, your needs or your desires for them will still stay there. And if you don't look at kind of flexibility, you're going to kind of create what we call your own brand of misery. So look at different ways to meet the needs. This is where your creativity comes into play. There's some interesting research, and we're seeing that a lot. In terms of our ability to adapt, a lot of that is related to our self-talk, the chatter inside of our head. Words activate different parts of the brain. For example, and you know this, there's one word when you use it will activate what we call the anterior cingulate cortex, which is the part of the brain that causes you to feel anxiety or panic. And that word is oh shit. If you've ever said that, tune into yourself and see what you feel. So words will start activating different emotions. One of the things we find, individuals who are struggling, individuals who tend to be more rigid, will say certain things to themselves, and they'll even say it out loud. Kind of one of the biggest statements that tells you you're going down the rabbit hole is if you find yourself saying, this is bullshit. This is a bunch of bullshit. Think about when you've said that. After you say it, tune into yourself and see what you're feeling. It's going to activate negative feelings. It's going to activate anger. Another one is, well, yes, but. Yeah, we can do that, but it's not going to be the same. So when you insert but in your sentence structure a lot, think about what it's doing to you. When we work with folks around trauma, I can tell how well they're dealing with trauma by how many times I hear a certain word. I hear them use this word a lot. I know they're going down the rabbit hole. And this word's going to surprise you. The word is why, W-H-Y. Example, so I was called in to work with some of the responders from Sandy, but the individual went into the elementary school and killed a bunch of little kids. Working with one of the responders, what he asked me was, why would somebody want to do that to a bunch of little kids? What could I say and what could any of you say to them? There's nothing. That's the difficulty about why. And trauma activates helplessness and hopelessness. And the more you ask yourself that, the more you try and answer it, further down the rabbit hole you go. In other words, if you try and answer it, well, why would somebody do that? And the person says, well, they're mentally ill. Then you're going to ask another why question. You're going to say, why? Other mentally ill people don't do that. So you've got to be really careful with the word why in trauma. Also in general, why activates a lot of weird things in our brain. When it's not trauma, why activates frustration. Example, those of you that have children that are old enough to talk, you ever told them they had to do something? You ever told them they couldn't do something? You ever hear them use the word why? Now, if you're dumb enough to answer that, what do you think your kids are going to say next? They're going to say why. And they'll keep saying why and why and why until you hopefully say something like, because I told you so. So in these times of stuff like the pandemic, it's really important that you listen to your language and begin to monitor that. Because your language can, it's what's called muscle memory. You say a certain word or you think a certain thought and it takes you down the wrong pathway. Now, you don't want to try and run a con on yourself. You don't want to say, oh, I feel great when you're lying to yourself. Don't do that. And that's important with cons. You know, you can run a con on your family. You can run a con on your coworkers. You can run a con on me, whoever, but don't run it on yourself. because you'll always lose the con. So you may not be able to say, you know, I'm feeling great, super. But there may be something between this is bullshit and life is super. Those are the words you need to kind of think about. What's the next level up from this is bullshit? There will be things that are up from. The other thing we're saying, and you've been hearing that and probably reading about it in the newspaper, is one of the things that's happening as a result of this as we move into the recovery phase is people are getting anxious about the recovery phase. And people are getting anxious about getting out there. What that means is your comfort zone has shrunk. We all have a comfort zone, different sizes for all of us. What that means is everything inside your comfort zone you don't mind doing. Everything outside your comfort zone you avoid. But if you do it, it creates a lot of anxiety. Now, a comfort zone can get shattered with a traumatic event. Like what used to be inside your comfort zone gets thrown out of. An example is, I was working with the folks who survived the Aurora Theater shooting. Up until July 20th, 2012, movie theaters were inside their comfort zone. Then that night they were there, people got shot around and they survived. The movie theater got thrown out of their comfort zone. You only have a certain amount of time to put things back in. And if not, then the world changes. We passed the 7-year anniversary. There are some of those folks who've not been back to a movie theater because they couldn't figure out a way to put it back in their comfort zone. Without trauma, our comfort zone naturally shrinks. It's like the rest of our body. If you don't work out, your muscles do what we call atrophy. If you don't push your comfort zone, it entrophies. Slowly starts to shrink away. And some of you probably know what I'm talking about if you've ever had parents or grandparents who used to be fairly active folks, and then they stopped doing things. And you probably saw their world shrinking and getting smaller and smaller. So part of getting through that is, and I recommend you do this on a regular basis, push your comfort zone. Force yourself to do something that you're saying, no, I don't want to do that, or no, it's too much of a hassle. Now, you don't want to do something real big. In other words, if you have acrophobia, fear of heights, you don't want to all of a sudden climb out a roof. But you may take one step of a ladder. So everything's successive approximations. So think about what you and your family can do to begin to push your comfort zone a little bit, just so you're always moving in the correct direction. You always hear, and again, this is becoming a bumper sticker. We'll get through this, you'll get through this. You hear it enough, at some point it kind of becomes white noise and you don't necessarily believe it. So part of getting through this is you and your family deciding, how do we define getting through this? What is it going to look like? What are we going to look like on the other end of the tunnel? And the other part is, as you're doing it, don't fear your anxiety. You're not going to die from anxiety. But if you fear it, it just makes it happen more and more. So begin to look at coping techniques. What are your stress coping techniques? How do you get rid of different emotions? Are you doing that, or have you given that up too? The way we control anxiety or stress is you have what are called countermeasures. The countermeasure needs to be at the same level of intensity as the anxiety you're feeling. The mistake people make is they try and use a technique that works when they're under low anxiety, and they're trying to use it for high anxiety, and it won't work. For example, one technique you may have is when you're under stress, you like to just sit down and read or listen to music. Now that works if your anxiety isn't too high. But if your anxiety gets too high and you sit down to read, you'll have this phenomenon where you read a line and you can't remember it. And you can't remember the entire page. So if it's a higher level of anxiety, your countermeasure needs to be higher level. That would obviously be some form of physical activity. The other thing with trauma and nightmares, we're noticing kids are starting to have bad dreams and nightmares. Nightmares are only scary when we keep them inside of our head. One of the mistakes parents make is kids have a bad dream and parents will go in there and say, it's okay, go back to bed and go back to sleep. That's not a good thing to do because you'll actually push your child back into the nightmare. They need to get stimuli into the brain. So one of the things we recommend you do is have them talk about, what was your dream about? Tell me about the dream. Because like I said, it's only scary when you keep it inside your head. As you begin to talk about it, it's not as scary. Then you have your children give it a different ending. It's a bad dream. So, okay, what can we do? Instead of you not being able to run when the monster's coming, what can you do? That's empowering. Now, the same thing works for you, talking about it, but you may not have anybody to talk to, or the person you could talk to is your partner who's asleep. And, if you wake them up and say, hey, let me talk to you about your dream, you may get this reaction. You may get them to say, hey, I'm not your goddamn therapist, leave me alone. So it's okay for you to write it down too. Stress you can get out tons of ways. In this day and age, we really shouldn't have stress. There's so many ways to get rid of it. Trauma is a little different. You're having trauma reactions like intrusions, flashbacks, or you're waking up the Book of the Dead. Those of you that have been in this field for a long time, you have a lot of chapters in the Book of the Dead. That doesn't mean you have PTSD. You probably have post-traumatic stress. Every event you deal with that involves death or injury activates a trauma response. And what you want to do is move it from a thought to your memory center. Individuals who develop PTSD, and you've probably seen it, maybe you know somebody, maybe you're struggling with it. True PTSD, if you haven't, would be like, think about the worst trauma you've ever gone through. And imagine that that's in your conscious part of your brain 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's what PTSD is like. So we always want to move it to the memory center. But it goes to a specific place in the memory center. It goes to what I call the Book of the Dead. With trauma, everything you see, you can never unsee. Everything you hear, you can never unhear. And that's why you're seeing some of the healthcare people committing suicide and stuff, because they're having to deal with so many people dying. And it's going to the Book of the Dead. We have never developed a technique, nobody has, to prevent you activating the Book of the Dead. But the good news is if you actually move the trauma to a chapter in the Book of the Dead, you can always get it back. It's disturbing why it's walking around in your head, but it can go back to it. So trauma, you can't lift it away. You can't go to the gym and move it to trauma. You can only get it to the memory center. There are only 3 ways. 2 will only work with you. The third way we can use with your little ones. Talking about it, writing about it, or with kids, we can have them draw and paint and clay and stuff. If you have no artistic ability, that ain't gonna work for you. That's why we have what are called debriefings. That's why, you want people to kind of process it. Some of you may not like talking, some of you may not have somebody to talk to. So you can write about it. It gets to your memory center, gets there a little slower, but it will work. Now, one thing about if you're using writing to move it to the Book of the Dead, once you write about it, don't read it, because if you read it, you just wake it up and all the ghosts come out again. So this has been a quick overview of kind of what we're struggling and what some of the things you can't do. What I'd like to do now, and I'm not sure how we're working this, is open it up if people have questions or things that don't make sense or areas I've avoided. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Phil, how you guys are doing it?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nicoletti. I just wanted to remind those, if you are in the Zoom chat, you can use the Q&A function to ask a question. If you are watching via YouTube, you can switch over to the Zoom login to put a Q&A question in. I've got a couple that I can start off with. One was, you mentioned with a minimum and maximum amount of time with your partner and going into tilt with increased hours and stress with coworkers. What are some pieces of advice to, if you might deal with something similar to what you dealt with a partner, with a coworker who you're spending more time with?
Excellent question, very appropriate. The same principles operate there. Sit down with your coworkers, and all of you, the more you can talk about these things, the better it's going to be. Talk about, okay, hey, we're going to reach maximum tolerance level with each other. What can we do about it? Come up with rules of engagement, come up with a plan. And you don't have to disconnect for long periods of time. Sometimes just taking, 10 minutes or 15 minutes away is okay to decompress. So come up with a strategy. Don't keep it inside. And that's an important thing, an offshoot of that. Again, there are certain words, like I mentioned, we never want to say. Another one is, if you're being bothered by something, something's getting to you, something's irritating you, you're going to have what we call seepage or leakage. Meaning, you think you can keep it inside, but you can't. Other people are seeing it. So one of the things you want to do is, somebody asks you, are you okay? Or what's the matter? Things you never want to say unless you truly are okay. You never want to say nothing, and you never want to say, I'm okay. Especially the kids. One of the things that really messes up kids is, they're sensitive to their parents. They see you struggling, and they ask what's the matter, and you say nothing. You're actually causing your kids to have decoding errors and confusion, because they're going to say, geez, I thought I saw something, but they're telling me I'm not. So they're not going to sure how to judge anything. So it's okay to say to somebody, I don't want to talk about it right now. It's okay to say, I'm just really agitated. It's okay to say I'm dealing with something, or it's okay to talk about it. But don't say nothing, and don't say I'm fine when you're not. So back on the original question, same thing with your coworkers. Set up some rules of engagement, talk about it.
Okay. And then you did mention limiting your media news intake. Is there a recommended amount per day, per week in general?
It's not that objective, it's more subjective. You'll know when you reach what we call too much, too long, too ugly, when you're watching something and you start feeling negative sensations in your body. Our body gives us signals about what's going on. So when you see something, feel something like that, then it's time to change.
Okay.
It's like having a sunburn. We always get clues. You've been out in the sun when you reach a certain amount of pain and you touch your skin and it hurts. So we take advantage of the physical. But the psychological, sometimes we tend to ignore.
And do you have any tips for taking time off, taking a vacation, along with potentially feeling guilt that you're abandoning your coworkers, that you're taking time off when you're most needed?
And that's a tough one. And that's kind of, you're looking at the culture and climate. And we're seeing that, working with some of the healthcare professionals where, you take time off and people kind of look at you, or somebody says, oh, it must be nice that you can take time off. Or somebody says, you're going to be doing that now? How can you do that now? So it's two things. One is you need to, at your workplace, set up a culture and a climate that, it's okay for people to take time off, to take a break, to recharge. That's number one. Number two, though, and this is something I can't give you, nobody can give you, but it's one of the best coping techniques people have. It's called permission. Giving yourself permission to take time off, giving yourself permission to go on a vacation, a staycation, giving yourself permission to just get away from it. Because guilt is, like I said earlier, guilt is a gift that keeps on giving. So if you take time off and you're feeling guilty, you're actually not doing yourself any favors. You're making yourself worse. You're supposed to be enjoying something, but at that point in time, you're creating your own brand of misery. So the key thing you got to work on for you is permission. It's okay to do that.
Okay.
You know, a good example I like to use is, I mean, this is survival is a kind of combination of physics. On an airplane, you know, if the compression goes out and the oxygen mass drop, what do they say to do first? Put it on yourself first. Because if you don't take care of yourself, how are you going to take care of anybody else? Our body has two levels of energy. It has what's called surface energy and core energy. So surface energy, it's a usable quantity. We use it at the end of the day and we go to sleep and it comes back the next day. That's the nice thing about surface energy. But if you drain it, then we do it into core energy. And that's like your battery. If you look at your battery, that's a good example. Your battery's working well and it's not cold, you turn it on, the surface energy starts it up. But if it's cold or the battery's getting old, you turn it on and you use up the surface energy. Now you start getting into the core energy where the battery's really just going sluggish. And if you utilize your core energy, it's going to take a long time to rebuild it in your car. You got to charge it. The body's the same way. So think about, yeah, I got surface energy, but I got to protect my core energy. If you're having to work long hours and long shifts and no time off, you're going to be tapping into your core energy. So try and be a little more protective of that.
We have one question here. Tips for those that are living alone, because I know we talked a little bit about your relationship with a partner, but those that are dealing with this on their own.
Okay, yeah. Humans don't do, we like to think we do, but we don't do that well when we don't have some type of social contact. So you may not be able to have in vivo contact, but can you have virtual contact? What ways can you connect to people? And there's two different types of connection we can have, either in a relationship or by ourselves. One is called parallel and the other is called interactive. And both of them can kind of feed that need. Like couples, parallel is you're both working together doing dishes and taking care of the kids. Interactive is where you're actually spending time playing games and having fun with each other. So if you're by yourself, look at, okay, I can't necessarily have interactive time with anybody, but can I have parallel? Parallel would be going to the grocery store, being around others, or just doing something that there's other people around. Calling, texting, there's a lot of social media ways to stay in contact.
Great. We do have one question here. As a paramedic, some of our protocols have changed where we cannot do much for a person in cardiac arrest. It feels if we are not able to do anything, especially for those left behind. How would you recommend dealing with those situations?
Those are tough. We've had to deal with some folks like that. It's a whole new rules of engagement there. Because you're going to feel totally helpless. You're going to feel like you abandoned the person. And that one, I wish I could give a right answer for that. There's not. You got to look at, how do I make sense out of this new normal? What do I do if I can't try and resuscitate somebody? How do I walk away from that? And what do I need to do to kind of feel that was something I had to do? And there's no right answer for that, but just look at, how do I get closure from this? How do I make sense out of walking away from somebody that I might have been able to resuscitate? And that's a tough one, tough way to get closure. It's very individualized. One example, this is totally off topic, but in one of the school shootings we responded to, Platte Canyon High School. Up there, little girl was, this guy comes into Platte Canyon High School, takes the kids hostage, and just has the girls there. One little girl is texting to her parents. Her last text to her parents was, "I love you guys," and he kills her. Now you're the mom or dad, and that's kind of the same thing. How do you make sense? How do you live with that? How do you make sense of that? And what they did is they developed what's called the I Love You Guys Foundation. Emily was a little girl killed, Emily Keys. And what they do is go around and try and help people. So that was meaningful to them. That's why I'm saying I wish I could give you a specific answer, but it's got to be something that's meaningful to you.
And now, I guess, with the police and fire being on the front lines, and we do see some protesting to end the lockdowns, what's an approach in responding to those people in the public who think that a lockdown is useless, that are not using a safe measure of distance?
Again, interesting, tough question. And that's a hard one because what we're finding talking to firefighters and officers is there's a part of you that realizes, okay, we need to be in lockdown, we need to have the social distancing and stuff. But then there's another part that, yeah, people are losing their jobs, and I can understand. You're in the middle of something where you can actually understand both sides, which is kind of an unusual thing. So what you got to do there is look at, okay, what's your role? Stay in your lane. Your role is not necessarily going to be to convince that person they shouldn't be doing that. Your role is to keep that person in line for whatever rules of engagement you have. But don't think you're going to go out there and get in an argument with that person and get them to change their mind and realize the error of their ways. Because the intensity is too much ground into it. And that's only increase. You know, everybody has a tolerance. And you're starting to hear, I mean, it's a mild way of looking at the word, but you're starting to hear quarantine fatigue. If it goes on too long, quarantine fatigue will turn into quarantine anger. And then quarantine anger will turn into quarantine rage. That's once we reach our tolerance level.
We did have a request, if you can go a little bit further into detail on what going on tilt means.
Okay, going on tilt. Another way to look at it is deviation from baseline. What were you like before the pandemic or the quarantine or the death or all this started? What are you like now? What's changed? Now, is it changed? Is it dragging you down the rabbit hole, which is the tilt? Are you beginning to have more negative symptoms than positive? That's what we're looking at there. And the key thing, like I mentioned, are you focusing on microstimuli? Are little things beginning to irritate you? And if they irritate you, do you find you're keeping that with you longer? So there are 4 ways to evaluate a symptom in ourselves: frequency, duration, intensity, and interference. Frequency will refer to how often you get a symptom. That could be a physical symptom of anger, could be a psychological symptom. Physical symptom of a headache, psychological symptom of anger, or trauma symptom of a flashback. How often are you getting it? The next level is duration. When you get a headache, how long does it last? When you get pissed off or depressed, how long does it last? When you have a trauma intrusion, how long does it last? Then the next level is severity or intensity. You can rate your symptoms. What does a low-level headache look like, feel like? Is it a tapping inside your head? What does a high-level headache feel like? That's a severity. It's like a jackhammer. Same thing with depression. Low level is you feel like kind of a funk. High level, you feel like you want to kill yourself. So that's the intensity or severity. Then the 4th one is interference. Low level, when you get a headache, it's low level, nobody knows you have it. As your headache starts to increase, people will be aware of it. Same thing with depression. You could be sitting there right now feeling a little depressed and folks around you don't know it. But as your depression starts to increase, you seep out and you leak out. Now it's interfering. So those are the 4 ways you measure where you're at and how far on tilt you're going and how far down the rabbit hole.
I think this may be our last question. And if you can discuss how to combat the fear of going out for those that are over 60 or maybe have some medical condition, how do you get over that fear to perform your regular duties?
Well, you combine fear with safety. So you don't want to just go out there. You look at, okay, if I've got to go out or I want to go out, what precautions do I need to take? You know, that's the thing we hear over and over. Okay, wear a face mask, keep social distancing. So that's your armor you're going with. And then the other part is slowly, baby steps. You know, what can you do that's a slow progression? You know, you wouldn't want to go out and go to a Rockies game right away if you're over 60 and you're kind of vulnerable. Go to something where you're feeling comfortable with. So baby steps and protection. Those are the 2 things for kind of folks who are kind of hesitant to do things.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it back over to Anthony to finish things off.
All right, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Nicoletti, for joining us today. And thank you, all of you in attendance today, for joining us for our first ever live stream. I'd like to also thank our staff that helped to organize this today. There was a lot of good information provided, and I'd like to repeat that Dr. Nicoletti has shared some documents with us relating to what we've talked about today. These documents are uploaded on our COVID response page on our website. Again, that link is on the video description on the YouTube stream, or you can type fppa.co/COVID-health. Also, a recording of this video will be made available to members that weren't able to attend live, so keep an eye out for that. Now, looking forward, we are planning to host more live streams similar to this one, so look forward to more invites and correspondences in the near future. And with that, we'll end it here. Thank you all for attending and take care of yourselves. Goodbye.